One of my favorite things to do when I travel is actually to work out in different fitness facilities. And I still am amazed to watch other fitness enthusiasts drop the weight when it's going back to rest. In other words, not controlling it. Did you know that when you do that, you're only doing 40% of a workout? Talking eccentric contractions today on the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast.
Welcome to the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast with Garrett Williamson. Health, wellness, exercise, nutrition, and a whole lot more. Got questions? Call us and leave a message at 251-278-EDGE or message us at Personal Edge Fitness on Facebook and Instagram, at Team PE on Twitter, or personaledgefitness.com.
Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Garrett Williamson, your host. If you're interested in more information on this particular subject or any of our others, or if you have any questions about health, fitness, wellness, especially if it's concerning a myriad of myths that are out there, which is the reason for this podcast, please feel free to contact us. You can contact me at my email address, which is Garrett, Garrett, at personaledgefitness.com. That is also our website, personaledgefitness.com, and our Facebook page, Personal Edge Fitness. If you would rather call us, you can contact us at our Mobile location at 251-341-0927 or our Eastern Shore location at 251-651-0927. Now, throw a big word out there, eccentric contraction. There are two parts to every lift. Let's talk about bench press, something most of us are familiar with. A simple pressing up a weight and then lowering the weight back down. Well, when you're lifting, the part of the contraction, or part of the lift that we think requires the most effort, where we're pushing up against gravity or pulling down against gravity. In other words, pulling the weight actually going up, maybe pulling your arms down, say in a lat pull down. That hard part of the lift, that's called the positive or the concentric contraction. Now, most of us believe that that's where we're doing the majority of the work. So much so that many exercisers tend to have a lot of control, maybe even an explosive type of lifting style when it comes to the concentric contraction. But when it comes to the eccentric, in other words, when the weight is going back to rest, many times they drop that. They don't control it. They let the weight fall back to rest, especially when they get tired. That part of the lift is known as the eccentric contraction and is extremely important. The reason it's so important is that it actually is responsible for about 60% of your development when you're doing strength training. Now, 60%, that's the majority. That's quite a bit. So it's something we definitely should be more than just a little bit concerned about. Well, as always, when I throw out kind of a big word like that I went to school and got a bachelor's degree and a master's degree to learn, spend a lot of money on, might as well at least share with you a definition of an eccentric contraction. The eccentric contraction is the motion of an active muscle while it's lengthening under load. Let me bring that into more of a realistic or give you a real world example of that. Think of a simple bicep curl. Think of when you're curling the weight up towards you. That's a concentric contraction, and it's pretty easy to see that your muscle is shortening. Why do we know that? Well, you can see it. You can see the bicep actually bulge when you do a bicep curl. That's why I think it's almost impossible for some guys to do a bicep curl without a mirror nearby. I can say that because, I are one. I understand that. But when you lower that weight back down, you can actually see that bicep go back down. In other words, the muscle's lengthening. It's getting out of that shortened state. It's lengthening. But there is some resistance. There's quite a bit of resistance still on that muscle. Obviously, you're holding a weight. Well, many times we drop that. And that lengthening of the loads is extremely important. Eccentric type training sometimes is overlooked. It's overlooked because it may not be as exciting as doing explosive concentric training, jumping up on a plyometric box or being explosive about a lift. But that eccentric contraction, you're actually doing more, quote unquote, damage to the muscle. Now, we've talked about damage to the muscle before. We've talked about the fact that when we're lifting weights or doing any kind of exercise, or if you're at a physical therapist office and they're manipulating a muscle or making you conduct exercises or moving the muscle through a range of motion, they're actually breaking down muscle tissue. when I talked about growing muscle in my podcast, I discussed this entire concept. I spoke about these concepts especially in episode 53 when I talked about muscle maintenance. I also discussed it when I talked about muscle development in episode 8. But basically, we're tearing the muscle fibers in order for the body to build it back stronger and better. Basically, you're telling your body, wrong, do it again, wrong, do it again. And I also have compared it to like a hurricane hitting your house. If you have a straw house, then you're going to build a wood house. If not a wood house, then a brick house. You're going to put hurricane shutters. You're going to make it stronger, make it tougher. That's what your body does. Well, damage in this definition, in this using it this way, we mean actually improving the muscle. So the more damage we can do to a muscle in a workout, where we're actually tearing fibers, not overtraining, the better. So if you're using a contraction that does the most damage, well, that's really what we're looking for as far as developing muscle, developing strength. It's also a little different way to train and happens to be very safe for seniors. I'll get into that in just a minute. But in the eccentric contraction, you are typically stronger and have more control over the weight, which makes it a very effective way of training a muscle, especially training a muscle safely. Now, this has been researched many, many years. There are several extremely famous studies on eccentric contractions, and we've known about this for a long time. In fact, Adolf Fick originally discovered in 1882 that contracting muscle under stretch could produce greater force than a shortening muscle contraction. So back in 1882, we found out that the eccentric contraction was actually almost more important than the concentric contraction. As always, though, just because I'm speaking about one of the contractions, I don't mean to throw the other one out. No different than when I'm talking about anaerobic training. I don't want to throw out aerobic training. It's extremely important. We need both. But I do believe that the eccentric contraction is often overlooked. It's so significant that as early as 1953, a scientist by the name of Erling Asmussen actually introduced eccentric training. Eccentric comes from the word eccentric, which actually means moving away from the body, the arm moving away from the body, the lengthening of a muscle. He actually started working on strictly eccentric training. This is not a new concept. This is something that's been around for a long time, which is why I said in the introduction, I'm still amazed to see exercisers drop the eccentric contraction. Now, many of these studies that they did on eccentric contractions involved bike ergometers, or primitive exercise bikes. We still use them in testing today, and we call them bike ergometers. But it's basically a very primitive, scientific, I guess you'd say, exercise bike. But the bikes, there was one study where they used a bike where the bike actually pedaled itself, and the participants tried to slow the pedals down. In other words, consistently doing eccentric contractions. Think about it. They weren't pedaling the bike to make it go faster. They were resisting the pedals in order to try to stop it. And that's where the exercise was happening, was when they were actually trying to resist. Another one that I actually just read about this recently. It's been out for years, but I thought it was fascinating because they wanted to find the direct effect or direct difference between concentric and eccentric contractions. So what they did is they took a bike, made it basically a double seat bike, to make a simple explanation of it, where one participant facing one direction, one participant facing the other direction, and the first, let's say participant A, would pedal, and participant B would try to resist. Participant A was actually doing a concentric contraction. Participant B was resisting the contraction or doing eccentric contraction. The bike is just one simple chain, so they're both working at the same force level. In other words, they're working under the same stress or the same weight. But yet, they could put a young female on there, a weaker female on there, and put a large male on the other end. The male was an A subject, and the female was an eccentric or B subject. The female could actually stop the males from pedaling forward and hold them back, so proving, once again, the eccentric contraction, you're actually stronger there. I've actually first started studying eccentric contractions in undergraduate because it was a famous study that dealt not only with eccentric contractions, but it dealt with several other things came out of it. They didn't know as much as they needed to know about eccentric contractions, and there were some participants in the study that actually got hurt because they didn't know as much as they thought they did about eccentric contractions. It actually caused some muscle damage, and so much muscle damage that somebody ended up in the hospital. Now, that's not going to happen to you unless you just overtrain. Of course, you overtrain in anything, you're going to hurt yourself. But what we found was that stressing that eccentric contraction, our athletes, our seniors, our weight loss participants, whoever's working out to make changes and make differences actually got more benefit by doing eccentric contractions. And actually, think about it, if you were required to go in and lift a lot of weight, well, you may think twice about that. But if you were challenged with going in and lowering quite a bit of weight down, you wouldn't be so concerned. I promise you, because if I gave you the choice of walking up the stairs of the Empire State Building or walking down the stairs of the Empire State Building, you're most likely going to choose going down. It's no different than if you're lifting a heavy box. You've got a heavy box and it's got to go up on a shelf, and somebody gives you the choice of, right now I'll lift that up and put it on the shelf, and later on you can lower it down, or would you like to lift it up right now? You would most likely choose lowering down. The reason I keep using all these examples is to show you that the concept of an eccentric contraction, being stronger in a negative or an eccentric contraction, is not foreign to you. It's something that you've always accepted. You've really always known. You just didn't know really the properties behind it. So eccentric contractions are commonplace. Of course, we do them whenever we lift, no matter what. But avoiding those, dropping those, is really a big waste of your time, big waste of your workout. One of the reasons why we are stronger in the eccentric contraction is that in eccentric contraction, lowering the weight, lengthening that muscle, requires far less energy. Far less energy to actually lower a weight than it is to lift it. Now, since you are stronger and you're conserving energy and what have you in the eccentric contraction, eccentric training is actually a safer way of training. Now, remember what I said earlier. I don't mean to completely throw out the concentric contraction. Still extremely important and something you definitely need. But look at it this way. Once you have completed a concentric contraction, you now have the weight basically under control. And when you are lowering the weight back to rest, you're just controlling it. You're controlling somewhat in a concentric contraction, but you're still having to act on it. You're trying to gain control of the weight. Whereas in an eccentric, you have control of it. Therefore, by lowering the weight down slowly and conserving that energy, you actually produce in DOMS, delayed onset of muscle soreness, you produce more tenderness in the muscle, but not as much pain and not as much tendency for injury. I use it a lot actually when we do pull-ups. I use it in quite a few different exercises. One of my favorite eccentric exercises is to do towel exercises with an athlete or with an exerciser when they're doing hamstring curls. They're in a prone position doing a hamstring curl. They curl their leg up. I wrap a towel around their ankle, and then I try to pull their leg straight while they're holding it the entire time. That's actually an eccentric hamstring exercise. It's no pressure on the back. They have control of the weight. And actually, we're really penetrating the muscle, really getting deep into the muscle. Another place I like to use this is pull-ups. Pull-ups, I think, is the number one bodyweight exercise. That's a personal trainer's opinion. There's no scientific study on this. It just happens to be what Garrett Williamson prefers. And I like to have as many of my clients as possible conduct a pull-up. If they have difficulty conducting even one pull-up, many times I will have them actually jump up or help lift them up to where their chin is over the bar and then lower themselves down. In other words, do an eccentric contraction. About 3 repetitive eccentric contractions creates enough strength to be able to conduct 1 concentric contraction. So 3 negative pull-ups would create 1 positive pull-up. We use this with our athletes now. I don't want to talk about senior training or senior fitness or any fitness training that you may think of as weak or non-athletic when we talk about eccentric contractions, because they're a very effective exercise for any exerciser, no matter what their fitness level is. And before I get into talking about using it in rehab or using it in an untrained individual, I'm going to talk about using it with athletes. And I don't think there's a single athlete that we work with that we don't do eccentric contractions with or work negatives with in one form or another. When I've got let's say somebody in football, I happen to have an athlete right now that's trying to increase his chest strength and shoulder strength and really is looking to increase his overall bench press max. And for many reasons, it's a fantastic exercise, but it's also one that a lot of coaches use to judge how strong an athlete is. So this is something that we'll definitely work on, and one of the things that we'll do a lot of, especially towards the end of his workout, when he basically gets to a point where he's having difficulty lifting a weight, then we're going to do eccentric contractions. I'm actually going to have him lie down on the bench, and I'm going to work with him on controlling the concentric, in other words, pushing the weight up. And then I'm going to see how much he can control on the way down, of course, guarding him and helping spot him if need be. But that way, we're going to increase his bench strength. I mentioned the hamstring curl earlier, and that's actually an exercise that I didn't learn while in my degree. I actually learned it training for pole vaulting when I was at the University of Georgia. We had a fantastic German strength coach who first kind of opened my eyes to eccentric contraction. I didn't know what it was at the time. I started studying it later, but he was the first one that conducted this particular exercise of using a towel to create a negative or create resistance in the negative or an eccentric contraction. And I don't think there's an athlete that comes through that I don't use that particular exercise with, because of, again, gaining incredible amount of strength, being able to do it for quite a bit of time because we're using such lower energy reserves, but I'm really, 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 really penetrating the muscle in a safe way. But getting back to the rehab or somebody that's untrained, going back to that same story I told earlier about, wouldn't you rather go into a fitness facility and think, all I have to do is lower weight today? How much easier that would be. Well, that seems to be less intimidating. It's definitely far safer to do with an untrained individual or a rehab individual, because we're putting them in a state where they have the weight under control, but now we are exerting resistance while they're able to control it, and we're actually penetrating the muscle. If they knew how much they were lifting, which we try to explain to them, how much what they were lifting, they'd be quite amazed at their own level of strength. And typically, our clients approach this with a lot less fear if they actually have to lower a weight. And eccentric contractions are involved in every single contraction. If you're lifting a weight, you've got to lower it at some point in time. So this can be done on pretty much every exercise. It can definitely be done on every body part. When I think of eccentric contractions, I can't help but think of plateaus. And plateaus, you hear about plateaus, you may have used that description in your workouts before, talking about having difficulty getting through to the next level on a lift, on certain type of exercise program. And typically it's used when we're talking about certain lifts. We talk about athletes hitting a plateau in a bench press and they're not able to get past it. Well, plateaus, believe it or not, there's some physiological evidence involved, or there's some physiological actions involved with hitting a plateau. There's everything from nutrition, from not varying the exercise enough to where your body has basically become immune to the changes in an exercise. That's part of the physiological, but plateaus have a lot to do with mental, believe it or not. Just mentally cannot get past a weight. We saw this a lot in pole vaulting. I see this a lot in athletes in general when they look at a height that they're trying to clear, or a time that they're trying to break, or any kind of challenge that they're trying to overcome, and they keep hitting that wall. They keep getting to a certain point. Speaking in pole vaulting terms, they keep clearing 12.6, but they can't clear 13 feet. And then once they break through, the mental change that happens when they actually break through, where eccentric contractions in lifting can help people get through that, where they may approach the bench press and they've been stuck at 225 for a long time. And so lifting 225 again, or lifting 235, mentally they just may not have it. Physically it could be a challenge, but mentally they may not have it. Well, that's the time when you would take, say, 235, even higher, depending on the athlete, and have them lower the weight. In other words, conduct repetitive eccentric contractions. Now they're getting, first and foremost, physically, this works physically as much as it does mentally. They're getting a feel for the weight. It doesn't feel so incredibly heavy anymore. It's starting to feel like 225 instead of 235 or even 250 if you're using that weight, because they're lowering and they're not getting as scared of it. On top of that, if you could bench a max bench or a 2-3 rep bench of 225, you should be able to eccentric contraction or lower at least 235, if not 240, even 250. Now, I'm throwing out numbers here, but I want you to be very careful. If you're interested in doing this kind of high-end training, you need to make sure you've got a spotter with you. And as always, I'm going to tell you to contact a professional, contact a personal trainer, get them to help you with that. So, and you're welcome to call us. And of course, I'm going to throw out the phone number. You can contact us at Mobile at 251-341-0927 or our Eastern Shore location at 251-651-0927. Be glad to set up an appointment with you and help you break through those, help you design a program if you're using eccentric contractions to get you to that next level. Now, just because we're doing an eccentric contraction and the weight is in a controlled state, and it is a rule of thumb, it's a safer way of training, doesn't mean that it can't be damaging. One of the studies I talked about earlier about the bike ergometer and the fact that study had a lot of data that came out of it, much of it they didn't expect because somebody was actually injured. By doing a lot of damage to a muscle, whenever you're lifting, whenever you're exercising, you're creating byproduct in your body. And what I mean by that is, I've talked about this before. I've talked about the burning sensation that you have when you lift a weight. That burn you have to the muscle, which a lot of people think is lactic acid, and actually in a lift it is lactic acid. That is a chemical release when the muscle fiber tears. It actually does burn your muscle. It's sending a communication to your brain to tell you stop. That's enough. Quit doing that. Well, lactic acid dissipates within 30 seconds of a lift once you've stopped. But lactic acid is somewhat toxic to the body, even though it's produced by the body. And it is possible to overload your system with any kind of byproduct, just like overloading your system with alcohol. You can overload it with lactic acid and you can go as far as kidney failure. Now, this is extreme situations, and in this study that I was talking about earlier, they actually had an athlete that did that. They trained so much in the eccentric contraction. And the inherent danger of an eccentric contraction is that you're typically not going to feel it. You'll feel sore, but you're used to being sore. But like I said earlier, you're creating a tenderness. You're not doing as much severe damage, but you may be doing prolonged damage that you don't realize until too late. So eccentric contraction, if you're interested in getting into that kind of training, again, I do recommend you consult somebody that is an exercise physiologist, not a weekend certified personal trainer, somebody that understands those chemicals, understands that kind of training, to set up a training methodology, a training protocol for doing using eccentric contractions in your training before you just go into, okay, that's it, I'm switching my entire workout to eccentric contractions after hearing Personal Edge Fitness podcast. That can be dangerous. It can be very dangerous, and it can cause severe damage. It can cause a lot of problems if not done correctly. Now, I don't want to scare you away from it. Obviously, I'm doing a whole podcast on eccentric contractions. I must think they're important. I already told you that it's 60% of your development, but as with anything, you want to understand what you're doing. You want to be safe while doing it, and you can overdo it. I mean, one of my favorite things, of course, everyone knows that I talk about all the time is drinking water. And that's something you can overdo. Well, eccentric contractions, yet again, is something that you can't overdo. On that note, and far be it for me to go through a podcast without getting into water, the best way, the best cure for pollution is dilution. Now, you may have heard that. The solution to pollution is dilution. So if you're doing this kind of training or any kind of training where you're getting really aggressive about breaking down muscle tissue, especially eccentric training, having a lot of water on board is extremely important. That will help your body deal with the release of the lactic acid and these byproducts that come from tearing down muscle, and actually help your body process it, therefore helping you speed recovery. I had to get that in. I had to throw something in there about water. It's just beyond me not to have. So yet again, the miracle of drinking water. I'm a big fan of this, and like I say, if I can help you with eccentric training or talk to you a little more about this, please feel free to reach out to me at Garrett, Garrett, at personaledgefitness.com, our website at personaledgefitness.com, or our Facebook page, Personal Edge Fitness. You're welcome to call me here at the Mobile location at 251-341-0927, or our Eastern Shore location. Josh would be more than glad to speak to you about eccentric contractions at 251-651-0927. Staying in the negative in your workout is not always that bad, especially if you're using eccentric contractions, because that's one more way that we help you reach your level of wellness. Thank you so much for listening, and please like and share our program. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast with Garrett Williamson. Subscribe now and be a part of the show by calling 251-278-EDGE or message us on Facebook and Instagram at Personal Edge Fitness or at Team PE on Twitter, and visit us at personaledgefitness.com.